Hi folks, here's a video to help in discussion and consideration for this final set of sections for the Q. So by this point, I'm hoping that you've finished the Q and you're ready to start thinking, start discussing this final section in order to start your brain thinking about the Q overall, and especially your discussion next week, we'll begin thinking about how that might translate into your papers for this book, okay? So let's talk about how we might approach these final sections in the Q, okay? First, I want to bring along some concepts from last week, all right? So we got some vocabulary to think about how to frame some expressions of power that we're seeing in the book. So they're saturating this book actually, right? So expressions of power and people responding and changing their behavior to expressions of power. So one thing I really want to note is that not all manifestations or expressions of power are necessarily bad, right? Some relationships will just have power dynamics to them, right? So for instance, parent-child relationships, a child will change their behavior as a result of a parent having power over them, right? Similarly speaking, a manager-employee relationship has a power dynamic to it. So do governments, so do teacher students, so do doctor-patient relationships, okay? So the thing to keep in mind in these relationships that wouldn't really make sense unless there was someone with more power than the other is that makes things relevant. It's not necessarily bad that somebody has power over somebody else, not necessarily, but it makes it something that we want to be careful of and attend to, right? So it's not that it's inherently bad to have a power relationship. It does make it, though, relevant for investigation. Okay, so what do we mean when we say that someone is expressing power or power is manifested in a relationship, right? That power exists. The definition we got from last week is that someone's behavior is altered as a result of of actions or potential actions from someone else. So the example we got from the reading, for instance, just the 7-page reading from last week, was a traffic warden and somebody parking, right? So the traffic warden could actively be expressing their power by giving you a ticket for parking in the same space, or there could be a passive expression of power if you park in a different space because you know the traffic warden will punish you, okay? So the key here is that behavior is either altered or is altered, right? So the is altered comes with getting a fine, right? Or you're altering your behavior because somebody has power over you. Okay, so here's how we're thinking of power is either you're navigating this power space by avoiding the repercussions, or you're getting repercussions because somebody has power. Okay, so hopefully from this understanding, you see that different power dynamics are saturating the Q, the novel, right? So thinking about how there are different power dynamics make a difference to our story, I think is a really helpful lens, right? So for instance, we have this political power structure, right? The closed gate, the restrictions on Tarek's ability to practice medicine, right? The relationship between Tarek and Yaya, right? Can Tarek help or not help, right? And their reactions, all these people's reactions to the power that's being exerted over them. But also we get a lot of power dynamics in the Q. I've asked questions about how the Q is developing its own kind of structure or culture that only happens because people are adjusting their behavior or receiving repercussions as a manifestation of somebody else's power or the group's power, right? So this is the way that I'm suggesting that you might think of power dynamics happening in the Q, okay? There are definite kind of switches or ramifications of the power dynamics happening in this last section. So I just wanted to encourage you to consider this as something that continues into our section, okay? So finally, let's think about our major locuses of action, okay? So first, what's happening in the Q? Okay, So from the first sections, we see the early development of the queue itself outside the gate. At this point, a lot has changed. We see a lot of the characters and the dynamics there really develop to their fruition at this time. So one thing I'd like you to really consider, because this might be helpful to you in the paper, how do you think the queue has changed, right? If you're just going along with the novel and you're reading and focusing on the sections in front of you, you might miss just how the queue at different times look dramatically different. Can you see a trend or development from the beginning towards the queue at the end? So some things you might think about is maybe the kinds of conversations that happen at the beginning versus at the end. We heard a lot of the background stories. People were getting to know each other. How did positions in the queue exist towards the beginning? They were pretty static, right? People were taking each other's place in line and stuff like that. How did people move around in the middle? How is moving around in the end? Was having a lot of different positions on the government, on what was happening to them. How okay was it at different times? How, I'm going to use the word egalitarian, just in terms of everybody having equal right to approaching the gate, approaching the value of their stories, right? The amount of judgment to different people's stories. Does that change over time? The degree of sharing information I've mentioned, right? How comfortable are the people with the queue, right? So you could just also consider, this is something I've been pushing for, how developed the culture of society it is, just independently existing in the queue. Remember, there's a whole town that still exists outside the queue. So this might be something that you think about in terms of the author telling you some part of the story and not others. She's focusing on the queue itself. We do have characters that exist outside the queue. How much are we learning about those people that do have lives outside the queue? How much of their lives outside the queue are we learning about, right? How much are we learning about anybody? The author's focusing, right? So we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, try to get some tools of analysis, try to consider the choices the author's making and how much we're learning about some people and why we're learning about those people. Are the characters in the queue that we do hear about the most dynamic in the queue, do you think? Are they supposed to reflect the particular changes in the queue? Right, so those are just some suggestions. I'm just encouraging you to start really thinking with this last section. What have you learned about? We're finished the book now. What is missing, right? Not that it's bad that it's missing, but that it might highlight what the author wants you to know or what the author thinks is most important, okay? All right, cool. Finally, let's think about what we know about our main characters, the characters that exist outside the queue, the characters that are moving the plot along, arguably, okay? So I'm thinking of these in terms of Yaya, Tarek, and Amani. You could argue that that's not the locus of consideration. I've had students make really good cases that it's more important what's going on with the queue than what I'm about to say. That's great. I want to make a point here, actually. Before we hit our main characters. One of my favorite authors says that a book isn't a book until it's in the hands of the reader. So a lot of people have kind of an idea that, for say in an English class, professors make this highfalutin interpretation of a novel where they're like, look at the symbolism, or oh my gosh, this really great connection the author made. Oh, this is clearly an allusion to the Shakespearean theme 200 years ago, right? And the author might be like, oh, I didn't intend that at all. Ugh, you're reading so much into my novel that I didn't intend, right? You're making me seem like a brilliant author and all I did was write a book down, right? But one of my authors is not upset about that at all, right? Instead, she says, look, the book is an experience of being read. And whatever you take out of it is worthwhile. So as we go towards considering writing your papers, the key for me is that you make a case for your interpretation. I want you to draw something significant out of this text. So with all my suggestions that there's a lot of intentional craft going into this novel, first off, there is. Somebody's just not writing a story and telling you about it, right? But whether we're getting the author's actual structure and intention right or not, I like the idea that a book isn't a book until it's read. And your experience with this text is valid and worth talking about. So that's the idea I have, which might start sounding like the highfalutin English teacher who's like, clearly this rose doesn't just mean a rose. It means that somebody is feeling so much passion, they're being overwhelmed. And then the next time we see red, it's harkening back to the rose. That means everything, right? We're trying to not go that far, but think about just like maybe what seems super significant to you about the construction, okay? Because it is valid for you to see things that are significant here. Yeah, okay. So let's think about where our main characters leave off. First, let's think of Tarek. Just as a character is what I'm going to mention here. There are a lot of different reactions to Tarek. So think about what is leading you to have your reaction. Okay, so some people take him to be like just in the middle of the moral spectrum. He's not this hyper virtuous guy who's leading moral stances, and he's full of generosity and kindness, but he's embattled with a difficult circumstance, right? So that's one end of the moral spectrum. But also he's not a despicable character, right? So he's just like kind of in the middle. He's a realistic guy. There you go. That's one stance to have towards Tarek. Some folks think he is a disappointing character. He should be meeting a higher standard. He's a doctor, for God's sake. Why is he struggling for the entire book, basically, right? So some people are really disappointed in him. Okay, so you could have a variety of other reactions as well. But think about how his behaviors at the end might fit or not fit with your impression so far. How does that make you think of him? Is it in time? Is it too little too late? What do you think actually is the result of his actions at the end? We have a bit of an open-ended conclusion here. And actually, last time I taught this, I was surprised by the spread of students' interpretations of the end. So that might influence how you think of Tarek as an overall character. A lot of the dynamics of the political society and government and the expressions of power are in relation to Tarek's job. So that's an interesting into thinking about what the society is actually like, is just considering Tarek and what he knows, how that changes over time, his rise in concern, and eventually his sort of flip. Okay, with Yeya, there are also a lot of dimensions of power happening around him. He alters his behavior in response to the impressions of whether he'll be punished, how impractical it is for him to fight the system, how willing he is to fight a system, such as the government, Tarek, the Q, right? If you remember way back in the beginning, he was much less likely to tell his story to people around him. He was aware that there was power acting against him with his information. So a question you might have about Yeya, do you think he navigates this well? Do you think it makes sense what he's doing? How does this relate to where he finds himself in the end? Would you act differently than Yeya? Are you satisfied with how he navigates this? Okay, finally, Amani. From my impression, at least, she starts out the book as kind of a force of nature, determined to do what it takes to force through the system to get her boyfriend healed. There are many interpretations of Amani, and that's why she's her own question, her own prompt for the paper. Okay, so I'm interested to hear if this strikes you as interesting, how you interpret Amani and all of her transitions throughout the novel. She has the most dramatic transition, right? So at the beginning, she refuses to think her government would let Yeya walk around with a bullet in him. She especially refuses to think a doctor would. Between all of the people that Yeya is befriended or is close to, she's the one who is most proactive, and you can interpret that proactivity with a variety of different like reactions and evaluations, right? You might think it's appropriate to inappropriate to like, what are you doing, Amani? To like, fuck yeah, why aren't other people doing this, right? So you can have a variety of actions. But throughout the government's different stances on even the presence of bullets, right? So they're like, you can't remove bullets, to it's somebody else's bullets, to at the end, there are no bullets at all. Her transitions from a fighter acting against things to one of the people that believe the messaging of the government that contradicts reality, right? What do you think this means? How do you line up her character with what's happening overall in the society, right? Why do you think we have this character? Do her transitions track other significant changes in the story? Does it track Yeya's health going down the tubes? Is she a symbol of something, right? So Amani's transition is symbolic of X. So here's her transition, here's what it symbolizes, and then here's what's going on with the symbol. That's a paper. You have to do those three things, explain those three things. Or is the character transition significant in another way? I would like you to think about the final prompt, which we might not have touched on too much, which considers how health is relevant to this novel, right? What I'm suggesting as our main characters are Tarek, Yeya, and Amani. They all have different relationships to health, right? Tarek is supposed to take care of health. Arguably, the society is too. Yeya's health deteriorates. Amani's fighting for health and then becomes incredibly unhealthy herself. She has her health forcibly stripped away from her, right? So considering health as a theme, I think would be really interesting. So I tried to develop that prompt to kind of give you an idea of how you might approach that paper. I think it would be interesting. Okay, so that's where I think our novel finishes and the things that we could consider. This video is a little longer than other ones because I think we have so much to wrap up with, and I encourage you to think about this a lot. So this week you have a standard discussion. Next week we have an open discussion where I hope you can speak productively with others about how you're approaching or you're thinking of approaching your paper for this unit. I also remind you that in the paper prompt that is posted, check out the paper. It's at the very end of the module for the Q unit. I remind you that you can get extra credit points by meeting with me about your paper. That's very important because your paper will be better if you meet with me, and you get extra credit for that reason. I'm encouraging you to do that. This is the first paper you have. While all of the other weekly assignments, you can do, 2/3 of them and still get full credit. And there is no late policy in this class. I've talked to a few of you about that because you can just not do the weekly assignments and then just keep looking forward, right? That's the best thing to do. Also, that's the best thing to do pedagogically. When people have late assignments, it actually undermines the quality of grades and work they're doing in a class. You got to get this paper in, okay? The class is structured so the paper due date is the week of the election, so you get to kind of chill out after that. We're just getting it in, and then we have the lightest week ever afterwards. So please work with me on that deadline. Come talk to me during office hours, and we will figure it out. We'll get you a game plan. It'll get in. It'll be wonderful. Okay, so sorry about the length of this post. I hope you're having as good a week as possible. Stay warm, stay healthy, take care of you, take care of others. Sending you all the good vibes. All right, so let me know if I can do anything, if I can make your lives easier. Bye.